This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State law professor Roger McEowen begins today's show with a discussion about the expiration of the Tax Cuts and Job Acts. He also says that people need to decide on farmland partitioning and digital assets for their estate planning. Keeping the show going is Wild West District agents Jade, Greene, and Honig, who are in town for annual conference to share how their part of the state is doing in agriculture this year. K-State Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts round out today's show. This week, Brad White, Bob Larson, and A.J. Tarpoff have a conversation about the best method for late castration. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with some information around agricultural law. And as always, we're joined by K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, nice to be with you, Shelby.
Roger, today talking a little bit about taking the time to plan things ahead when it comes to agriculture and taxes and estate planning. And first, talking about the Tax Cuts and Job Acts. And first off, what is that?
Well, it's a law that was enacted right at the end of 2017 that took effect beginning for tax years that started after 2017, and it runs through 2025. So that changed the tax law dramatically in a number of areas. And, of course, one of the things that many people are familiar with is that it substantially increased the federal estate tax and gift tax exemption. From then, $5 million, and doubled it, and then set it for inflation increases each year, and it's now just shy of $13 million per person to offset taxable estate at death as well as taxable gifts made during life. That will expire if Congress does nothing. That's just one of the things that will expire at the end of 2025, and that one goes back to $5 million with an inflation adjustment. It'll probably be about $7 million. So it'll essentially, with two more inflation adjustments, one for 2024 and one for 2025, before it reverts back to the old law, it's basically going to be cut in half. And so many people are familiar with that, many farmers and ranchers in particular, and that raises some concerns from a planning standpoint, because if that exemption collapses to essentially become $7 million, then that's going to have an impact on a lot more farms and ranches than the current law does. And that's just one aspect of what will sunset if Congress does nothing.
And a couple other aspects is talking about health insurance and mortgages.
Right, that's true. For homeowners, the current limit on the mortgage interest deduction will be removed, and so that's a good thing for a lot of people that have high-value homes or have multiple homes and are not able to fully deduct the mortgage interest. Also, the 2017 law, TCJA, removed the penalty for not getting government health insurance, the mandate under Obamacare, the penalty that was associated with that. But that'll come back starting in 2026 if Congress does nothing. Some other things that are there, people in the lower income groups will see a substantial tax increase. For starters, those rates are going to go up. Currently, those people that are paying federal tax at a 12% rate are going to see a 25% increase in their tax rate. And the standard deduction is going to be cut back in half, basically. It's going to be reduced back to where it was prior to the 2017 law, because what that law did, what TCJA did, was double the standard deduction. Now, it eliminated a lot of itemized deductions, but many people don't itemize. But it doubled the standard deduction and took a lot of lower-income people completely off the tax rolls. Well, those people are going to come back on, and then those that are, for example, in the 12% rate under TCJA, if Congress does nothing, they're going to see, as I said, a 25% tax rate increase. A couple of other things in there, Shelby. The lower limit on charitable deductions will be reinstated, and another big one, particularly for farming operations and other small businesses, is that if you're not a corporation, the 20% deduction on business income will go away. And that can be a very, very large, for example, six-figure deduction for certain farming operations, and that's going to be eliminated. So that is a major concern that's out there also.
Are there things then that producers and people should be thinking about now to maybe start planning ahead for if that doesn't get changed?
Well, the trouble with this is that we don't know what Congress is going to do or not do. So all we know as of right now is that if they do nothing, it's already baked in the cake, so to speak, as to what will happen starting in 2026, and many, many changes will occur just automatically. We've already seen how difficult it is to get a farm bill through or even have hearings on a farm bill or have any discussion with respect to a farm bill. And I'm concerned that Congress is, regardless of who's in political power at that time, in the executive branch or in the legislative branch, given the current situation in the world and economic issues, the level of the national debt, how difficult it will be to sustain and continue the existing tax scheme that we have. And I think we're probably in the most favorable tax environment that we could possibly be in, and it's only downhill from here. So with that said, what can we do? Well, it's very difficult to put a plan in when we don't know for sure what the future holds. But what we can do is be talking with our tax professionals and our planning professionals and being in touch with them to make sure that whatever plan we have in place is flexible enough to deal with any changes that might occur, deal with it in the best way that we possibly can. And that's the key, is really to kind of stay in tune, stay in touch with your professionals as to what your plan is right now, what your tax situation is right now, what your estate plan is right now, and be able to adjust as quickly as you possibly can as soon as we know for sure what Congress might or might not do.
And Roger, on the topic of talking with professionals and some of that estate planning, sometimes people choose in their will or in their trust, say, we'll let the children figure it out when it comes to farmland and other things. And why is that probably not the best option?
Well, because if you just think you're just going to let your kids figure things out after you and your spouse are gone, it's likely instead that a judge will, because there are likely to be problems amongst the children. And some people may think that, that's not a concern. My kids get along. Well, yeah, they get along while you're still around, assuming a head-knocking role. But once you're gone, all bets are off. I could tell horror stories for probably the next 4 or 5 hours with respect to that issue. And indeed, one of those situations where a judge gets involved is when the parents have left farmland in co-equal ownership to multiple kids after the last of the parents to die. And what I mean by that is that situation often leads to a partition and sale of the farmland, with the proceeds being split amongst the children, because there's commonly a child that says, yeah, this is where I grew up, this is the farm, but I really don't have an interest in it, I don't want to farm it, I'm not interested in it, I want the cash. And so they want to cash out, and they have that ability to force that as a co-owner. And that's where, if you haven't put appropriate estate planning documents in place, such as a buy-sell agreement or some other type of estate plan where you avoid co-ownership, co-equal ownership amongst the children after you and your spouse are gone, you can get into that partition and sale situation, and we just don't want to go there.
So something, probably take the time to think through and talk with your children and have a conversation about what they want and what you want?
Yeah, that's a good place to start, is make sure everybody's on the same page. Communication is the key, and then having the proper estate planning documents so that property is titled appropriately. And if there is an on-farm heir, we can get the property into the hand of the on-farm heir and use some other type of inheritance to balance out, or some other type of arrangement, such as a lease arrangement, to balance out the inheritance of the off-farm heirs. But that on-farm, off-farm heir issue is a big issue that has to be addressed.
And one other thing, among many other things in estate planning, is digital assets and thinking about those important documents.
Yeah, this is one area of estate planning, I think, that's often overlooked, and it's part of a broader issue, and that involves cataloging where all of your important documents are located and who has access to them. That is very helpful when, for example, when the first spouse dies, in particular, so that the surviving spouse knows where the necessary documents are at. Now, when you throw in digital issues, the access issue is important when it comes to the decedent's digital assets, such as accounts involving emails and online banking and credit cards and social media. The question there then is, who has access to the decedent's digital assets and information? Now, certainly the estate's executor or the trustee, the fiduciary, should have access, but it's the type of access that is the key. They need the ability to read the substance of electronic communications, and that should be clearly specified in the account owner's will or trust, and often that is overlooked. if we're looking to have access to digital assets and information and have that access granted to a third party before death, that type and extent of that access should be set forth in a power of attorney. Another thing that I think is often overlooked, because we'll run into situations, even if you've done planning, that a service provider will, such as an email account holder or a company, a digital company, will require that the fiduciary get some type of court order before they release digital information associated with the granting of access. So the key point here, Shelby, is that digital assets now are a very common piece of an estate. So we have to make sure that we've taken the necessary steps to allow the proper people to have access post-death. And that's going to save us time and expense during the estate administration process. But I fear that right now is a severely overlooked step.
Can there be tax consequences for exchanging digital assets after death?
Well, there can, because IRS has taken the position that digital assets, such as cryptocurrency, for example, are a form of property. And if it's a form of property, that has basis implications associated with it, and that has capital gain issues associated with it. And so we've got to work through those issues also. So it's not just a matter of access, and then it becomes a matter of tax issues post-death also, and that requires record keeping and documentation.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us a few things that we should probably think about as we look forward for estate planning and taxes.
My pleasure, Shelby.
That was Kansas State University and Washburn Law Professor Roger McEowen. I will put a link in today's show notes on agtoday.net where you can read more work from Roger. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show now, talking with some agents who are currently at the K-State Research and Extension Annual Conference here in Manhattan, Kansas. And today's agents are Wild West District Livestock Agent Jade Greene and Wild West District Crop Production and Horticulture Agent Ron Honig. Jade, Ron, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having us.
And Jade, starting off with you, what is agriculture like in your region?
We've got a little bit of everything, I would say, anywhere from dairies to feedlots, mid-size feedlots to small size, and then cow-calf producers in the area. That's predominantly the cow-calf side of it. So.
And Ron, kind of looking now at the crop production and horticulture side of agriculture, what is that like in the Wild West District?
Well, of course, we have quite a bit of irrigated ground out our way. So we have this section of we have areas of dryland crops, and then we have, of course, our irrigated crops. And so we always kind of try to separate those and talk about those differently when we're discussing agriculture. But we've seen we're kind of at the northern end of the cotton belt. So in the last 20-some years, we have had cotton in our area and do have gin at Moscow in Stevens County. So we've seen soybeans move a little bit more out in our area. Normally, we're not a soybean area. We have high pH soils. They haven't done well. With better varieties now and iron supplements at planting time, we're seeing more soybeans in our area. So that's a little bit of a change. But generally, we're irrigated corn area, some irrigated milo, big dryland milo area, definitely some irrigated wheat, many acres of dryland wheat in our area, and then dryland cotton and irrigated cotton.
And we'll talk a little bit more about how crops have been doing in your area. But first, the weather, something really important to agriculture.
Yeah. Well, it's been kind of a roller coaster ride weather-wise out in our area. So we came out of the winter just extremely dry. So we came out in a drought that we'd been in for at least 8.5 months. That one of the weather stations in the northern part of Stevens County only showed 1.25 inches precipitation over 8.5 months. You move over into Haskell and Seward counties, there's weather stations were showing about 2 or 2.5 inches of precipitation over that same period of time. So we came through the winter very, very dry. And so we came out, things were just looking rough. And then about April 25th, it started raining. And it rained. And it rained. And it rained up until the second week of July. And then it shut off, and we went through 2 months of basically hot, dry, windy weather, and didn't rain again until about the second week of September. So we had this roller coaster that we were on very dry and then very wet and then turned off dry again. And now it's kind of balanced out as we come into the fall. We've gotten a few little rains that's helped with getting the weed out of the ground, and we've calmed down a little bit. So unfortunately, though, before it quit raining, it also hailed, and we had a big swath of hail go across the northern part of Stevens County and then east into the rest of the district. And then we had quite a bit of green snap, which is just high wind on that green corn, and just when it's nice and crisp, it'll just break over. So we saw quite a bit of green snap also in the corn.
And so for corn, soybeans, and milo, how is harvest going?
Well, we've moved right along now. So for the most part on the corn, of course, we have dryland corn. A lot of that was cut out early, and some of that didn't do as well going through that 2-month dry period at the end of the summer. So a lot of that it wasn't great yield-wise, so it got cut out early. It dried up and was cut out. And then guys were just waiting on the irrigated corn to dry down. So most of the dry land's cut out at this point. Probably what's left isn't real good, and guys are either going to not harvest it or they'll catch it once they get their better irrigated corn done. But we're probably overall about 70 or 75% complete on our corn harvest out in our area. Then you probably look at milo. There's still quite a bit of milo out in the fields. We're probably looking at 30% harvest complete on the milo fields in our area. Soybeans, we're probably 90% complete.
And so with harvest happening and corn and soybeans kind of getting on the end tail for harvest, what have yields been like?
Well, overall, the crops haven't yielded as good as they look, and that's kind of been the general consensus from the farmers and consultants that I've talked with, that for corn, they're probably yielding 15 to 20 bushel lower than expected. Just as they walk through the fields or drive by the fields, they're not producing quite as well as they had expected. Early on, the fields that were cut out early, we were looking at probably 170, 200 bushel an acre corn on the irrigated. And they were looking for the later corn to be a little bit better, and it is somewhat better. Guys are telling me maybe 20 to 30 bushels an acre better on the later corn. Probably going to come out averaging around 230 on a lot of these later fields. So they were looking for maybe around 250, but I don't think there may be a few that make it, but generally we may not get there this year. But so probably around 220 overall might be considered a good year where we're setting this year anyway.
And Ron, what about milo and soybeans?
Yields on milo, again, we haven't cut out a lot of the milo yet, but on the dry land we're probably looking at 15 to 40 bushel an acre yield on the dryland milo. I don't have any figures yet on irrigated. Soybeans, it kind of varied, but generally they were good. Probably 60 to 80 bushels an acre. Field averages would probably catch most of the fields. I know personally of a field or two that was over 80 bushels an acre, up in the 90, averaged up in the 90 bushels an acre range. So, of course, soybeans, they'd all be irrigated out in our part of the world.
And Ron, you mentioned that you're on that northern edge of the cotton belt. And so what has cotton looked like this year in your region?
Well, our cotton acres really took a hit this year when we had that rainy period that came in for a couple months. The weather was cool. It was wet. That's not really good cotton growing conditions for our area. So we basically just have enough heat units to finish out a cotton crop in our area. So anything that slows that cotton down or puts it behind is a problem. So we saw probably 75% of our originally planned cotton acres, either they didn't get planted or they were planted and got destroyed. So we're down to about 25% of our original cotton acreage. So it was just too cold, and it was just not a good cotton growing year. What we have now, what's there, doesn't look too bad. Maybe not heavy boll loads on it, but we're going to have a crop. But it won't be nothing like what we had expected. So.
And Jade, now kind of moving over to livestock production and looking a little bit more at cattle. When we've talked about cattle markets with our livestock economists, they've talked a lot about herds retaining less animals. And is that something you're seeing in your area?
It is. Last year's drought really, really hurt, and so numbers were down to begin with, and I think that they were not rebuilding this year, so numbers, they're just kind of sustaining where they're at. They're not getting rid of more, but they're not saving to build that herd back up quite yet. And so we've seen that in our feedlots in the area, the heifer number of heifers on feed have stayed the same from last year to now, and so that just means that they're not retaining those replacements back to try to rebuild.
Jade, looking specifically then at the feedlots in your area, how are those?
Our feedlot in Stevens County is, I would say, contrary to the rest of them, they're doing really well. But the manager there has an in with some dairies that are now getting into the crosses, those Holstein Angus crosses, and so they're feeding a lot of those out now, shipping those in from California. So the feedlots in our area are okay. I know in other areas that their head counts are way down, but we're doing okay.
So seeing that collaboration between the beef and dairy industries coming together to hopefully be successful on both ends?
Yes, yeah, because our dairy numbers in the county, they're up. I mean, so dairies are growing. They're talk about adding a new one in there in the area, and so dairy cattle is becoming a more prevalent thing to our area.
And so, Jade, kind of overall, how are your agriculture producers?
They're doing well. I say well as in the agriculture producers there. I mean, they're resilient. But if you are farming or ranching in that area, you know what you're getting into. We're dry. We might have rain, and so I feel like our producers are they come back from anything, and so they're doing well.
And Jade, you'll also be having an upcoming program at the beginning of the year that people could attend.
Yes, so January 9th, we were selected to host the calving school through K-State Research and Extension, which we're really excited about. So we're going to have Anthony Tarpoff down and in Sublette, and he's going to talk about stages of the normal calving process, so some tips to handle difficult calving situations, when and how to intervene in the calving process. And then they actually bring a life-size model, and they go through how to pull that calf and go through some of those situations. So we're pretty excited to have that down in our area. Most of the time they're a little farther away, and so our Southwest Kansas people have to travel if they want that opportunity. So we're super excited.
And as that time gets closer, where would people be able to find some information?
We will have our flyer up on our website, so wildwest.k-state.edu, and we'll also post some things on our Facebook page, just the Wild West District.
Jade, Ron, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today and share with us some information from your area of the state.
Yep. Thank you, Shelby.
Thank you.
That was K-State Wild West District Livestock Agent Jade Greene, and she was joined by K-State Wild West District Crop Production and Horticulture Agent Ron Honig. You can see more information from the Wild West District at wildwest.k-state.edu. I will link that in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead.
You're tuned back into Agriculture Today. I'm Allie Nippert for Shelby Varner, and we conclude our Wednesday show with this week's Ask the Experts from the Beef Cattle Institute.
Hi, welcome to Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts, where our experts answer your question. I'm Brad White, happy to be joined by two great experts today, Dr. A.J. Tarpoff.
Pleasure to be here.
And Dr. Bob Larson.
Hello, guys.
So we're happy to have you listening, and as always, if you send us a question, we'll get our experts to answer them. You can send that to bci@ksu.edu, and when they answer them, they get up to 10 points for their answers. Today's listener question is a great one. It starts off by saying, I know you have recommended to castrate my calves earlier, but I've got to weaning with bulls, and now I'm planning on castrating them. Should I use surgical castration, knife cut, or should I use banding? Bob, I'm going to go to you first.
I'll admit my preference has always been knife cut, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is I think that I get it done today, and if I'm going to have any negative effects, it's right now, and I can address them while I've still got cattle gathered. And so I really prefer a knife cut situation. We've done a little bit of research here that says that there might be some advantages to a knife cut type of at weaning.
So your plan is knife cut?
Yep.
Okay. 5 points for Bob to start out with. AJ?
Well, we forgot about the most important piece on castration is before anybody castrates an animal, we have to be able to count to 2. Okay, so that is the most important. Number 2, I'm actually going to bring up some of the research we've conducted that it depends. Now, I understand surgical castration is great in some scenarios, but given environmental scenarios, and environmental parameters. And if we have really dusty environments, if we have really muddy or harsh, cold or hot, knife cut may not be advantageous. Where banding some of these heavier animals will give us an opportunity to get over that hump of that environmental extreme.
Okay. So AJ starts out with banding. So now I want to know some of the pros and cons. Give me some of the pros of you're picking surgical castration. Give me some of the pros.
If I'm going to have any problems, it's excessive bleeding or something like that. And that's going to happen immediately. And so if there's a problem, I know about it and I can detect it. Some of the things that AJ said, really cold temperatures, really hot and dusty situations, I agree that that's maybe one of the negatives of knife cutting, but sometimes those could also be negative of banding. So I'm going to stick with my knife cutting, but I'm not really opposed to banding done well. And we've looked at pain. And again, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. With my knife cut, it's more painful than banding for the next few days. But then the pain pretty much goes away and the animal does fine. With banding, the pain response is really at the time that the scrotum falls off, which is in several weeks. And so it changes the timing of when kind of that danger period is or where the pain is.
So you're liking it because it's done and then we start.
And then I can quit worrying about it.
Okay. AJ, give me some pros and cons from your perspective.
So one of the pros with banding is it's easy to teach. Okay, there's a lot of people that aren't comfortable with a scalpel or a very sharp knife up underneath the animal. You know, when we start thinking about employees getting injured, things like that. A band, they're relatively easy to use, they're easy to teach, and you can do a lot of them in a given day. I think that's number one. We mentioned that it can take several weeks for the scrotum and everything to fall off. That is a negative, and when it does fall off, it does cause some pain, and we see a hit in performance. Now, there are some things we can change or modify how we do the band. It's been published. We can split the scrotum with a knife on the lower area of the sac. Now all of that falls off within really a couple days. We're looking at 3 to 7 days that we'll have the majority of those already fall off and well on their way to healing.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are some techniques that you can do with either of these that will make them a little bit better, more efficient. You talked about some of the things relative to castration, how we're going to handle those. Any specific disease sequelae that you guys are worried about with either of these?
My number one is tetanus. Tetanus is, whether we're banding, it increases the risk of tetanus. If we're going to castrate, doesn't matter if it's knife cut or banding, we need to at least vaccinate with a toxoid whenever we're castrating.
Excellent. So great points on both those, and it looks like pick what fits your operation and the type of cattle based on when you can do the observation. Good perspective from both experts. Bob ended up with 8. AJ ended up with 9. So thanks for joining us. If you have further questions, send us an email at bci@ksu.edu.
Once again, that was K-State's Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts with Brad White, Bob Larson, and A.J. Tarpoff. I'm Allie Nippert for Shelby Varner, and that's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.